The overall topic of this Blue Talk is quite broad, and many of the aspects were mentioned. One key aspect that was mentioned was, of course, from the very first speaker all the way to the last one, is the new implementing agreement of a new international legally binding agreement of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea on conservation of sustainable development of marine biodiversity in areas beyond natural jurisdiction. I'm just waiting for the acronym, like everybody else, to be able to say that without using the whole title. But this new implementing agreement is a huge challenge. And just to give you some perspective, the Convention on the Law of the Sea took about a decade to negotiate. The new implementing agreement, the PrepCom, perhaps some of you in the room have been part of the PrepCom, as I was 15 years ago, is now going on to its 15th year, and we're supposed to finish an agreement by this year, earlier next year. There was a very important statement in Brest signed by several heads of state this year, where that emphasizes the importance of having an agreement. One of the subscribers is people like President of France, Emmanuel Macron, but also President of Colombia, Ivan Duque. And the President from Colombia will be joining a conference that we are organizing together with Ministry of Foreign Affairs. When I say we, is the Portuguese Institute of the Law of the Sea, precisely to emphasize the importance of reaching an agreement in due time. Also relevant is the example provided by Pakistan. It is a maritime nation. It has a long history connecting its coastal communities with the ocean, and it is found in a crucial point of connectivity around the world. There are very few countries positioned like Pakistan is positioned, and in a similar background as Portugal in many aspects. Unfortunately, I cannot go into detail in many of these aspects. However, Pakistan, similar to many countries in the world that are located in the Indian Ocean region, one would always find that there are many challenges. One of these challenges that is hindering the prospects of an agreement that we are trying to accomplish, not only in the conservation and sustainable use of marine biodiversity, but generally speaking, the ambassador for Kenya made a very important remark that was the ocean is the backbone of many coastal communities and countries. And one of the biggest threats that we have, not only for the marine environment as such, but to all of us as part of the same species and living off the ocean, we always have to remember that every second breath we take comes from the ocean. The overwhelming majority of the oxygen that we breathe comes from the ocean. And therefore, one of the biggest threats that we have is one that's not being addressed, and that is maritime environmental crimes. As I was looking through an angle for my keynote speech, I decided to do some research on the areas of interest of NIMA and the areas of interest of Pakistan. And I believe that combating maritime environmental crimes is just one of those very key important aspects that has to be taken into consideration. It brings together two very important aspects, that of civil society in one aspect, but also one of law enforcement. However, what we see in a very large perspective worldwide is that civil society is far ahead than law enforcement is. And I will come to this in a moment. If we look at the bigger achievements and advancements that have been made in the last years, climate change, sea level rise, ocean acidification, some of the examples that have been mentioned, were put on the agenda by scientists, civil society at large, and that has led states to follow and actually deliver on those concerns. And I believe that the Oceans Conference in Lisbon is precisely that. It is one important opportunity for states to deliver on the promises that have been made to civil society. And there are many aspects, and therefore I commend the government of Portugal, to which I'm extremely thankful and very proud for that initiative, and also the government of Kenya in delivering on that promise. And hopefully, by the end of this month, early July, we will all be celebrating some palpable outcomes of the conference. But as I mentioned, there is always another side to every story. And in the case of trying to promote a message of a positive message and a constructive message, we must understand that the ocean is one ocean interconnected, that is not that is impermeable to maritime boundaries and political boundaries. Whatever happens in Lisbon will affect Pakistan and vice versa. The ocean is interconnected. One very good recent example that highlights this was the earthquake in Tonga, that produced repercussions all around the globe. We on shore did not feel those repercussions, but those offshore felt them. And this emphasizes how the ocean is interconnected. So it doesn't matter if we have pristine, clean waters in the northern hemisphere, if in the southern hemisphere there are no abilities to cope with pollution and maritime environmental crimes, or, for example, illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. And therefore, this holistic approach is very, very important. Not only a holistic approach that is very much connected with the ecosystem approach in managing the maritime space, but also a holistic approach making sure that the net is neatly tight so that we're not protecting the ocean on one side and leaving the door open for criminal activities such as pollution to continue, and of course hindering all our efforts that we're trying to achieve. So for this reason, I decided to focus my presentation on this Achilles heels of the international law of the sea. And this is perhaps together with a lack of protection of people at sea. These are two aspects that are very close to my heart, and I believe need to be addressed specifically, and perhaps not now in June, but hopefully in another UN conference, we will be able to deliver on these two concerns: crimes, environmental crimes, and the protection of people at sea. What are maritime environmental crimes? Why maritime environmental crimes matter? Why is this topic relevant? What does international law say about this? Why nothing has been done? Who is responsible, and what can be done? As you can see, these are questions that were raised by a law professor, if you had to guess my profession. But the idea is to really highlight that there is one common background to this problem. It is a problem that is out of sight of most people, and therefore it's out of the mind of those that are making the decisions. And we need to bring this topic to the attention of civil society at large, and of course, consequently to put it on the agenda of states. It doesn't really matter if it does matter, but it is not. It is the efficiency of trying to adopt measures to avoid pollution of the maritime environment, for example, from land-based sources. This is nothing compared to an purpose oil spill of a cruise line with 5,000 people on board out in the Indian Ocean. The impact will be felt for many, many years, and we will not know if that is a consequence of measures taken on land or if it's something else. Because one of the biggest concerns is precisely the nature of these crimes. The maritime dimension of environmental crimes is very different from what's happening on land. Firstly, we do not collect as much evidence in a timely manner as we do on land. Many accidents or willful pollution takes place when ships are en route in close to specific countries where surveillance is low, and in many cases doing this during the night, when there's less movement of ships and therefore less possibility of being identified by other passing ships. So on the one hand, we have these circumstances, but on the other hand, when we look at environmental legal regimes, and this is something that governments could already do, when we look at legal regimes applicable to environmental protection on land, we have environmental crime in most countries in criminal law, but we do not have a specific provision applicable to the marine environment. And perhaps many of you are asking yourselves, why would we need that distinction? But I hope to convince you at the end of this presentation that such a distinction would be relevant and effective. Damage at sea is also not always detected. This is one of the biggest challenges we have. The environmental crime can take place, and then we only would see it after days after the ship has passed, or we would only see it even hours after the ship had discharged willfully the oil. And therefore, this impact will the fact that the impact only takes place sometime after makes it very difficult to establish the nexus of causality between the act and the damage. Of course, we have to distinguish between accidental pollution, which does not mean that there is no legal responsibility, and when ships actually fail to report for fear of legal and financial repercussions. There is, of course, no harmonization on the standard of evidence that is admissible under different national jurisdictions. For example, if an act of pollution taking place in a neighboring country to Pakistan, let's say India, and that pollution has an impact on Pakistan, which most likely would, then the question is, the evidence that is collected in India, how would that evidence be used in a court of law in Pakistan, for example? So there are many legal challenges, and all these challenges only have one beneficiary. They make it possible. They create the environment, the permissive environment for maritime environmental crimes to continue. Alas, there is no specific data on the value of maritime environmental crimes. They are perpetrated everywhere in the world and includes a wide array of activities. As I mentioned, those perpetrating these crimes use deceit and concealment as part of this modus operandi, and crimes occur when vessels are en route, taking advantage of low visibility and the fact that they can actually mingle amongst other ships, and therefore making it even more difficult to pinpoint which ship is actually responsible for the crime. There are many different kinds of environmental crimes happening at sea: dumping of illegal equipment of fisheries and other such crimes, activities. But oil pollution is by far the largest part. And we see this happening in unseaworthy vessels, oil tankers, old merchant ships, to ships engaged in illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, but also, most astonishing, by luxury cruise lines. Cruise lines that travel the world, and they pick and choose in which waters they will do this illegal discharge of oil, because they know that in those countries there is a very weak law enforcement, and there is very little possibility of actually being prosecuted in those countries. And this must stop, because this allows perpetrators to cherry pick where they commit these crimes. But we have a legal answer to this problem, and I will come to that shortly. And although we do see a decline in accidental and intentional discharges in recent years, the impact of human-produced incidents greatly offsets natural processes because of the large number of oil that can be released in a single incident. Just to illustrate, and this is some recent data, and some that's not so recent, 53% of all petroleum reaching the marine environment is human-produced and occurs near coastlines. Most of 2.1 million tons of oil is discharged every year into the sea, and it goes undetected. So the likelihood that this 2.1 million tons of oil is the result of crimes being committed at sea is extremely high. Crimes, of course, affect those that are more vulnerable, and those are found in coastal communities, because coastal communities, not only their livelihood depends on fish, but their economic livelihood depends on being able to fish and sell off that fish. And of course, we have spent millions and millions of dollars in improving oil spill response and cleanup and restoration, but still it takes a long, long time to recover. Just to give you an example, an oil spill that happened off the coast of Alaska almost 20 years ago, only last year saw its final decision in a court in the United States. And therefore, it takes a long time, not only to conclude the legal process, but the restoration process is even longer. And in most cases, restoration is impossible, and therefore damage is irreparable. And there are many examples around the world where the impact of a maritime environmental crime has actually resulted in people just moving out and those areas of the coast being completely isolated from communities because of the profound impact that pollution is still having on species, fauna, and flora, of course. And why do people continue committing these crimes, you may ask? Well, first of all, perpetrators are organized and act in a concerted and evasive manner. That's why many coast guards and navies have a lot of difficulty in dealing with this, with the aim of committing these crimes at sea, taking advantage of existing gaps and overlaps in international law. And of course, they only do so because there's a huge financial reward, because not calling into port and not being able to use facilities and avoid procedures is, of course, saves them a lot of money. The reward has been estimated between $80,000 to $220,000 every year per ship, depending on the size. And of course, it can represent for each ship between 5 to 12% of operating costs of a ship. So as you can see, the financial reward of committing these crimes is quite impressive. There is, of course, a lack of awareness and clear sense of direction by states to address this phenomena. But of course, as I mentioned in my initial remarks, no state is able to tackle the causes and consequences of these crimes by itself. It demands really a coalition of states to lead by example and to propose a way forward. The existing legal rules addressing spatial and functional jurisdiction are not applicable to these crimes, and therefore we do have a possibility of conflict of jurisdiction and, of course, gaps. Generally, there is effectiveness of international law to prevent and combat maritime environmental crimes and lack of specific legal rules addressing these crimes. Just to highlight two examples of two important operations that took place, one in 2018 and 2019, led by Interpol. It was, as you can see by the PowerPoint, these were two very important and quite sizable operations involving hundreds of people and agencies and means and resources, and the outcome is quite extraordinary, with thousands of convictions and of processes taking place under criminal law in different national jurisdictions, and therefore it is quite impressive, and we need more. However, we do not see them as frequent as we could because of existing international law. I will not waste too much of your time with legal peculiarities, namely conceptualization. I have written extensively on this topic, so if you have any questions regarding this, feel free to reach out. And I will, almost coming to an end, focus on the multi-jurisdictional challenge that I previously mentioned. And the question that we have to ask ourselves is, and I'm sure that this audience is knowledgeable on the law of the sea, is how do we tackle existing gaps and overlapping rules that cause conflict of jurisdictions and consequently the effectiveness of international law to prevent and combat international environmental crimes. And this is by far the biggest challenge. We have an overlap and conflict of jurisdiction, and that comes to a very specific case of sometimes a state having jurisdiction but not being able to enforce it, or a state wanting to enforce jurisdiction but not having the ability to do so. The other problem is that if we leave the law of the sea and look at human rights perspective, because environmental right is a human right, we also see that there are not many avenues available to us in order to proceed with the criminalization of maritime environmental crimes. However, we do have a very good example, and that is of the United States. Most convictions that we see today are taking place in American courts because of the legal framework they have developed precisely to deal with this problem. One of them is the regime on whistleblowers and the Oil Pollution Act and the Act to Prevent Pollution from Ships. On international level, we do not have anything similar. There is no international organization that has a specific mandate to tackle this problem, not even to collect information on maritime environmental crimes. And there is no organization that would be able to do so without revisiting its own mandate. We have one example, and that is the IMO with the SUA Convention, and that perhaps could be used as an example on moving forward. In conclusion, I would say that there is a deep disconnect between international law and the protection of marine environment from criminal acts. Existing rules do not echo the overall concern, and there is no international legally binding rule or body of rules or principle that criminalizes or that establishes an obligation to states to criminalize maritime environmental crimes. We need recognition and adherence to the concept itself. And of course, we must use the opportunity of other efforts, such as the proposal for an international crime, such as ecocide, which we are now seeing being referred in the context of the war in the Ukraine. And we must look at this also from a maritime perspective. In conclusion, I would say that both the concept of sovereignty that we see today being referred at sea, as in state, coastal state, port state, and flag state, must also include the responsibility to protect. And that is easier said than done. In short, I believe that when we are looking at the broader picture of the many achievements that we are seeing in ocean governance, considering the amount of threats such as sea level rise, ocean acidification, and climate change, we also must focus on the larger global view that of the distribution of resources around the world to combat the other threats that are even stronger and those that I mentioned, and must be addressed with the same efficacy. Thank you very much for your kind attention, and I do apologize if I took too much of your time. Thank you.